So we'll make a start. Welcome to our webinar, Marred by Money, the Impact of Economic and Financial Abuse. And we've got a range of listeners today, which is really fantastic. We've got Peabody residents, Peabody staff and professionals from other housing providers. So welcome. Just a quick health warning. We're obviously going to be talking about domestic abuse and some of the content you might find triggering. I'd like to welcome our guest speakers. We've got Judy Barber, who is the Debt and Benefit Specialist from Surviving Economic Abuse.
Thank you, and thank you for having me to speak at the webinar. So I'll just introduce my organisation, which is Surviving Economic Abuse, and my role within it is domestic abuse debt and benefits specialist. So part of my role is giving training for professionals and for general public, really, to understand economic abuse, and in particular how it links with debt and as well issues with benefits. 1 day a week I work on the financial support line, which we run in partnership with an organisation called Money Advice Plus, which is a debt and benefit money advice charity. And the purpose of this line is to give advice specifically to survivors of this type of abuse, and because they have, as we'll be talking about, very sort of particular circumstances and particular issues that might not necessarily be understood by sort of generic mainstream debt and money advice services. Just to tell you a bit more about C. So we are, as far as we know anyway, the only UK charity who are dedicated to raising awareness of economic abuse and improving the responses to it. So as we'll see, economic abuse is not something that's been concentrated on very much in the past when we talk about domestic abuse in general. And that's why our founder felt there was a need to look at this specific type of behaviour and how it affects people. And not just that, but to improve the responses from professionals. So from financial institutions such as banks, creditors, lenders, insurance companies, housing providers. And one of our services is to deliver training to organisations like this. Thank you. So the next slide, please. Okay. So I know quite a few people will be familiar with what domestic abuse is, especially after the 16 days. But I just wanted to really highlight that now we have the domestic abuse bill going through Parliament. We expect it hopefully to become law next summer, if not before. And for the first time in the statutory definition of domestic abuse, we've got economic abuse alongside the more well-known types of behaviour, such as physical violence, threatening behaviour, and obviously psychological and sexual abuse. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, and it's worth really pointing out, and this is something we're a bit pedantic about really in our organisation, the difference between financial abuse and economic abuse, because these terms are used interchangeably, but they shouldn't be really, and it's important we don't do that, because economic abuse as a concept is much wider than financial abuse. So financial abuse is a subcategory of economic abuse where we're talking just in inverted commas about money. So financial abuse would be controlling, restricting or exploiting someone's access to cash or to their bank account, for example, not allowing them to have a bank account, whereas economic abuse describes a range of behaviours which occur in a relationship which extend to all other sort of economic resources, such as housing, utilities, transport, food even. And we're going to look at some examples of that in the next few slides. The reason why we're quite pedantic about the terms is that when in the past we used to ask survivors or service users if they'd experienced financial abuse, quite often they'd say no. He always lets me have money, or she never takes my bank card, that sort of thing. But while that might be true, at the same time, the abuser might be making them ask permission to take food from the fridge or to put the heating on. They might not be allowed to have their phone unless they follow certain rules, or they might not be allowed access to the car, for example, or to their documents. So economic abuse is much wider and encompasses a greater variety of behaviours. Okay, next slide, please. So the next, this slide and the next two, going to look at some objects which we probably most of us use at least a few of them in our everyday lives, and just going through them. If you just imagine for this one how your day would have been if you didn't have access to all of these things. So being able to have a drink of water, being able to boil some water for a cup of coffee or tea before starting the webinar, sanitary products for women, toilet paper, soap, shampoo, that kind of thing, a blanket to sleep under. Imagine, would you, I mean, it's a bit different now, everything's online, but going out into the world to work, would you be able to go to work if you hadn't had access to these things? Next slide, please. And these slightly higher value things, such as the phone, cash, keys, you know, these are things that you need to just to function, really, to live as a member of society, to get to work. They're things that they're a link to the outside world as well. The phone, especially now during lockdown, the phone is sometimes our only way of talking to people outside of the house, only method of entertainment and socializing sometimes. Next slide, please. And the next documents, so passport, letters in your name, bills, so you know how much you owe and to who, certificates from any training or courses that you've been on, and CV. I mean, maybe these aren't things that you need every day, but if you imagine what life would be like if you didn't have access to these things, or if you had to pay to get a new passport, or if you had to get these things to do a DBS check for a new job, there would be a lot of obstacles really to moving on. And these are all economic resources, and these are all things that perpetrators of abuse can and do restrict. Next slide, please. Okay. So looking exactly what we mean at economic abuse, and we really were delighted that economic abuse is now included in the domestic abuse bill, because it's the first time it's really been recognised in law. So if you remember the definition of domestic abuse in general, so it's A being the perpetrator, B being the victim. So it is any behaviour that has a substantial and adverse effect on B's ability to acquire, use, or maintain money or other property, or obtain goods and services. So as we've seen, that would be mobile phone or a car. Goods and services can be the most essential things like food and clothing, but also utilities, gas, electric, and water. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to use some examples of perpetrator behaviour, and these are things that we've all, you know, in the course of my work and in the course of the work of our organisation, these are things that survivors have all given us as examples of things that have happened to them. So stopping the survivor to have the ability to acquire money or resources in the first place. So interfering with or sabotaging the victim's education, training, or employment, preventing him or her from claiming welfare benefits. So this is something we see very frequently, unfortunately. Perpetrators will often destroy documents. So it's difficult for the survivor to move to a new job, to do a DBS check, for example, or sometimes they'll make it so difficult for them to go to work that they'll underperform at work and end up losing their job. There was a really strange example that I heard quite recently, where a woman who was suffering this type of abuse, she lived with her husband. They were both solicitors, so both very high earning. But when he deemed that she had broken one of his rules. In the morning, he would go to work and put all her shoes in the boot of his car. So, this was before working from home as well. So she couldn't leave the house unless she was willing to go to work and get in the tube in her bare feet. So she would end up bringing in sick, and this almost led to her losing her job and becoming dependent on him. So it can be things that you wouldn't necessarily see as an economic resource, like a pair of shoes, can be used as a tool by the perpetrator. Next slide, please. So demanding receipts, given the victim a certain amount of money to live on. It's often referred to as pocket money, even if it's their own money. Sometimes perpetrators will demand that she produces receipts to account for and then he'll check the change to account for every penny that's spent. And often, if you think about receipt as well, it doesn't just have the it doesn't just have the amount of that you've spent, but also the time and the place that you bought whatever it was. So receipts are often used as a way of tracking her movements as well. And sometimes refusing to contribute, using up all of her surplus income, so that money that could be spent on leaving, on building a new life, is used up, and committing fraud in her name, or coercing her to take out loans, which is something I deal with at work on a daily basis, really. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to look at the overall effect, and I just want to point out about the gender. We have here economic abuse limits women's choices and ability to access safety, and we primarily do take calls from women on the financial support line, but we know men can be victims as well, and women can be perpetrators. And sometimes it's not just couples or intimate partner relationships where this type of abuse occurs. It can be sort of wider family members, adult children to older parents, for example. And I think there'll be a couple of case studies later where we look at that. But we tend to see where the most severe examples, where there's a risk of severe physical harm or even death, it tends to be where it's a female victim and a male perpetrator in an intimate relationship. So often this type of behavior, the exploitation, the control, and the sabotage, leads to the victim survivor being dependent on the perpetrator, maybe looking as though they're bad with money, that they can't manage by themselves, but really it's because of the behavior of the perpetrator. And this results in them staying longer because they can't leave in the relationship, and being more at risk of physical harm, sometimes losing their job, not being able to study, to realize their potential, and sometimes even ending up with a criminal record. Next slide, please. And just to confirm what I mentioned, is that really anyone can be at risk, but what we find is that abusers will exploit an existing vulnerability or existing dependence. And in the case of women, we often find that this type of abuse will start or really be exacerbated with the first pregnancy or the birth of the first child, when she will naturally become less involved with the outside world, more at home, and more dependent on a partner. That is when abusers will often start to exploit that situation. And other groups who already experience discrimination or inequality are also vulnerable. So disabled people, for example, and we find gay men as well report high levels of economic abuse. And as I said, it covers all family relations, particular, even though we mostly deal with intimate partner relations. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry, this isn't very clear, but I think you're going to get the link posted in the chat. So this is a tool that we put together on our website, which illustrates what economic abuse is, and it can be good if it's something that you're come to terms with in your own life, or you're working with somebody, or you have a friend or family member who has suffered this type of abuse, because it shows the different tactics that survivors from pretty much all over the world have reported, and it really helps to show that it's not, because a lot of survivors will say, I thought it was just me, or I thought it was because I was bad with money, I thought it was because I was irresponsible. But when they see it in front of them, the tactics that are used to gain economic and power and control over them, it helps them realize, that it's been a process and it's not their fault, most importantly. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay. And we want to point out as well that this is a type of abuse that doesn't need physical proximity. Often with physical abuse, often after leaving, obviously it can be the most dangerous time, but once sort of survivor is in a place of safety, has taken various measures, she will hopefully be safer and the abuse will end, because there's a distance between her and the perpetrator. But it's often on separation where economic abuse can start, where letters from creditors start coming, where the perpetrator starts running up court costs by dragging things out to the family courts, for example, withholding maintenance, and just generally making life very difficult. I'm often asked, why do people go back to the abuser if it's so bad after leaving? And it's often because of economic reasons, because their resources have been depleted to the point where it's extremely difficult to support themselves and their children, after leaving a relationship. Next slide, please. And whether you're a professional or whether it's something you've experienced yourself or you're concerned about a friend or family, it's good to be aware of some of the signs that economic abuse might be taking place. And these things don't necessarily mean it's definitely happening, but they are common indicators. And the volunteer survivors who work with us have often said, I wish somebody had picked up on these things in my case and offered to help, or just let me know the help is available. And that is often not socializing, because they don't have money to socialize, but maybe being that person who always leaves early, is always constantly checking their phone on nights out, whatever, using cash and not a card, because they don't have access to the card, and have high amounts of debt, but nothing to show for it, and no idea of how much they might be technically receiving benefits, but they don't know what benefits they get, and they don't know what they're called. They might not even know how much they earn because it's going into someone's account, or they might not know how much rent they pay or anything like that because it's been taken out of their control. Again, like I said, having to give up work, and often appearance mismatched to that of suspected abuser. Often we find the abuser is in like new expensive clothes, has more newer electronic devices and phones, where often the victim survivor is more, because she doesn't have access to these things, is wearing older clothes, not appropriate for the weather, etc. Wages or benefits paid into someone else's account, often on the guise of helping them, of looking after them. You often might say things like, oh, I'm no good with money, so she sorts it out for me, she's in charge of that type of thing. Then damage to property. Perpetrators will deliberately damage a property, so it's difficult for victims to get rehoused. Rent arrears, and often you find victims will say things that indicate low self-worth in relation to money, such as, I'm no good with money, I'm no good with finances, I'm useless, I don't understand numbers, when it's not true, but it's something that they've been told perhaps again and again by the perpetrator. Next slide, please. And this is something I think we're going to send in the chat as well. So I think this is a useful document. I'm not going to go through it because it's quite detailed and quite dry as well, but this is a useful document to know about. It's not, the Financial Abuse Code of Practice is an agreement which most of the high street banks have signed up to, and basically they've agreed that they're going to recognise and respond better to customers who are experiencing this type of abuse. They're going to be more helpful to victims who need to close a joint bank account, who have debt built up in their name, who need to open a new bank account in an emergency. They've agreed to accept PO box numbers as an address for women or men who are living in refuge, and to provide as well non-geographical sort codes. I don't know if anyone's ever Googled their own sort code, but it often gives you the bank where you're registered at. So obviously, if you fled a relationship and you've got a new address, which the perpetrator doesn't know about, but he has to have your bank account to pay child maintenance, for example. If you give him a sort code that's geographical, he could potentially track where you are. So this is an important thing to be aware of. So I would definitely would recommend having a look in detail at the code of practice. Next slide, please. Okay, and these are the wheel that I pointed out before is one of our resources. On the C website, we've written lots of leaflets like this, and some of them are in audio form as well, where we talk about help that's available, how to deal with coerced debt, how banks can help, how the police can help, how economic abuse can affect your credit report and what you can do to mitigate against that. So that's definitely worth having a look. Next slide, please. Just to say that we have resources for victim survivors and also resources for professionals. So there's two sections on the website. These are some organizations that can help. That's the top one is our financial support line, which I mentioned. We're open Monday to Friday lunchtime, and National Domestic Violence Helpline is a 24-hour for men and women who've experienced abuse. It's the first port of call. Women's Aid website is very good as well. Men's Advice Line, as you would imagine, is for male victims. And these next two, the Financial Ombudsman Service and the Communication Ombudsman, these are if your bank, for example, isn't responding, if you've reported economic abuse and they're not responding, they're not keeping to the code of practice, you can take it to the Financial Ombudsman. And the Communication Ombudsman Service, this is something I forgot to mention, but what we often see is perpetrators forcing victims to take out mobile phone contracts that can last up to 2 years. And then the perpetrator often just goes off with the phone, sells it, and the victim's left paying for the contract. Some phone companies aren't very responsive to this, unfortunately, but sometimes when you take it up to the Communication Ombudsman Service or say that you're going to, even, that can help to get things moving. And if you're not aware of Charis grants, that can be very useful. These are grants which are available in, the subject to availability to help with arrears with gas and electric and utilities for vulnerable people. Okay. So I think now we're going to hear a recording from a woman called Rebekah, who is a volunteer for us at Surviving Economic Abuse. She suffered quite severe physical, emotional, and economic abuse and coerced debt from a partner. She's since separated from him, has done a lot of work, and now does a lot of work to raise awareness of her of this type of abuse. And she's done amazing. She's got her own business. She recently won a Pride of Britain award, and she wanted to leave a message, really, to say that that there is hope of moving on. And so she wrote a letter which we've recorded with her permission. It's not her voice, but we've recorded it, because she was happy for us to play it and to get our message across.
Life for me really began the day I thought it was over. In 2012, I opened my eyes to find myself laid in a hospital bed surrounded by my family and police. For 5 years, I'd suffered all forms of abuse. When I finally found the courage to end the relationship, my ex told me he was going to kill me. The next night, he assaulted me to the point of needing reconstructive surgery. And it wasn't until I lay in a hospital bed that I finally heard the words domestic abuse. Up until that point, I'd never even heard of it. I had no clue what it was. Regardless of whether it would have changed anything for me, educating people about domestic abuse is imperative. It can save lives. The more I learned about domestic abuse, the more I wanted to do to help others. So I started doing work with various charities to raise awareness. I wanted to turn my negative into a positive. I had a beautiful son, and I was determined to do all I could to ensure his life was a happy one. During the relationship, my ex knew the PIN numbers to my bank accounts and would regularly steal money from me. He wouldn't give me money towards living expenses and made me get loans and store cards in my name. Every now and then he'd buy me gifts. These gifts were then used against me, and every time I asked for help with the bills or questioned him about taking money from me, I'd be told I was ungrateful. I didn't ask for the gifts or even want them. I just wanted to be able to provide for my son. I remember days I'd searched the house for spare change just to be able to feed him. On top of this, you're dealing with physical and emotional abuse, so debts are pushed to the back of your mind. What I think is very important for people to understand is that to anyone else, there were no obvious signs of this. I was always well dressed, and so was my son. I became very good at hiding the abuse. Unfortunately, society seems to have a stereotypical view of what they think a victim should or shouldn't look like. This misconception can further imprison a victim. Because of the attack and ongoing issues, I moved address. One day, having been there for some time, I received a debt letter. Because I'd been dealing with my mental and physical recovery, I hadn't even begun to think of the debt. I then started receiving more debt letters demanding the money from me and threatening court action. I had barely any money to feed myself and my son, so I was trying to recover and protect my child from the ongoing issues. So I would contact the debt companies and explain the situation. I would cry and beg them to help me, but I was told there was nothing that could be done. The debt was in my name, so therefore I was responsible for it. I didn't know what to do or who to turn to, so I ignored all the letters. But over time they built up, and I decided I needed to face the debt and find a way to pay it back. I finally reached out to someone I knew, and they recommended a debt charity to me called Step Change. The people I spoke to were extremely understanding and helpful, and through them I started paying back the debt each month. That was a real turning point for me. Accepting the reality of the situation gave me back some control over my life. For 7 years I paid it off and had resigned myself to the fact that I'd be in debt for the next 16 years. But doing the work I do, I was determined to find a way to help others and make changes where financial abuse is concerned. So I started doing some research, and that's when I came across the charity Surviving Economic Abuse. After a talk with someone from the charity, they gave me the details of a project. The people running the project worked with me to build up as much information and evidence from my case and contacted the creditors to request a write-off. This was a success, and after years of paying off the debt, I'm now officially debt-free, and it feels amazing. I can finally start to rebuild my life knowing I don't have debt hanging over me. Another major turning point for me during my recovery was when I decided I wanted to take control of my life and finances so no one could ever control us again. I decided I wanted to do more to give my son and I a better life. One night I started looking online for business courses and came across the Prince's Trust. I took part in the Enterprise programme, and since that day I've been working on my business. I've now got my own clothing brand that raises awareness for domestic violence. A percentage of each sale is donated to IDAS, the charity that helped me. I'm finally in a position in my life which my bills are paid on time and I have money to buy food, and it's a great feeling to finally be able to do that. Financial freedom for me isn't about being able to buy nice things. It's about being in control of my money. Being able to live the life I choose to. Financial freedom for a victim can protect them and give them security. What I would like to stress is that my advice comes from years of recovery. It doesn't happen overnight, and something I've found is very important is to accept the bad days. There are going to be days where you struggle, but by allowing those days and accepting them, you don't battle against it. When I accept my bad days, I feel more in control. I tell myself I'm not going to feel like this forever, and tomorrow will be a new day, and I can start again. My life is now how I choose it to be. I surround myself with the right people and positive things. And although I've mastered the art of self-soothing, I do reach out to people close to me when I have a down day. I don't want them to fix me or to try to heal me. I just want them to listen and understand. And that within itself helps me. Don't ever feel like you can't reach out to someone. One of the most valuable things I've learned throughout my journey is that happiness is within you. There are people in my life that bring joy to my world, for example, my beautiful son. I see these people as blessings. I do not rely on them for my happiness. Genuine happiness comes from making yourself happy. It is truly freeing when you discover this and learn how to do it. When you learn how to make your own happiness and how to create a life for yourself in which others cannot affect that happiness, You are free, and you can live the life you want to live. I know that things are easier said than done, and as I explained, my journey has been a long one. I had to trust in the process and have a belief that things would get better. I believe that we always have two options when things get tough: to carry on existing or to start living. Always choose to live. I promise you that once you make that choice, things can and will get better.
Thank you. And thank you, Judy, for what was a really good introduction. And I think that kind of that explanation about how economic abuse is so much more than holding on to someone's money, you know, the cold hard cash side, really useful. Thank you. Okay, so unfortunately, Danny, who's our in-house expert, has had some technical issues. So I'm going to try and deliver his slides. I'm probably not going to do it justice, and I might not be able to answer as many questions as he could, but I will certainly try my best. So if we could have Danny's slide deck up. Okay, next slide. Lovely. So from Peabody's perspective, these are some examples of when we might be able to identify that there is financial abuse or economic abuse. Predominantly when we're having discussions about rent arrears, that's usually when people would come to us and we'd be having conversations about money. And if somebody is reliant on another person to pay that rent, you know, an indicator that there might be financial abuse ongoing is where, okay, that rent is not being paid, but also where the tenant doesn't have any knowledge about what the setup is and what is supposed to happen. We might identify the risks when we're completing benefit forms with people. And we might notice, for example, that the tenant doesn't have an understanding of what benefits they might be entitled to or what benefits they're getting. And again, if they have savings or not, just a lack of understanding about what they have or what they don't have. We also might identify risks when we're looking at income and expenditure, and we can see actually there's a real difference in those two things. And we might notice that the resident, again, has limited knowledge or understanding of what A, they've got coming in, and B, what they've got going out. But sadly, sometimes, you know, these discussions come too late and the resident is already picking up the pieces after discovering that they've been abused in such a way. Next slide, please. So what do we do when we identify this? So there's several things we can do. Firstly, when the resident is vulnerable, so when there are additional care and support needs, for example, you know, a disability or something similar, we might be making a referral to safeguarding. So that's safeguarding adult services. And we'd also be encouraging that tenant to make a report to the police. We'll see if we can get those arrears, the debt, written off, being able to evidence that there was coercion or threat, or, you know, the debt has been acquired against their will. And if we can't get that debt written off, we'd be looking to negotiate payments, so setting up a plan at an affordable rate, or even looking at the possibility of a debt relief order or bankruptcy. And finally, we might be looking at rehousing that tenant if there is an ongoing risk from that perpetrator. Next slide, please. So financial abuse, you know, as Judy's mentioned, you know, is often the tip of the iceberg. It's just one form of abuse that sits under, you know, that broader umbrella of domestic abuse. And people very often experience multiple forms of abuse. It's, you know, it's unlikely and not very often that you just have a single type of abuse. So that might include emotional and psychological abuse, coercive and controlling behaviour, sexual abuse, and or physical abuse. And what's also really common is for people not to necessarily be able to recognise these behaviours as abusive, particularly at the start of a relationship, where somebody has been kind of groomed to think this is okay, this is normal, actually some of this is helpful, you know, where the behaviours are kind of wrapped up as caring behaviours. So not everybody will recognise that what is happening is abusive. But where a resident does need to be rehoused, the local authority are usually the people that provide temporary accommodation. And that's either until it's safe for the resident to return home, or they're found alternative permanent accommodation elsewhere. And what's really important in terms of benefits, so housing benefit or universal credit, is where somebody is moved into temporary accommodation and they make a dual claim for housing benefits, so both of those properties are covered, is that they state there is an intention to return to their former property. What that means is that that dual claim will last a lot longer than if that individual says they do not intend to return to their property. And I might be wrong, but I think it's 52 weeks. I'm sure Judy can correct me if I'm wrong. 52 weeks of joint housing benefit claim in these circumstances, again, where the tenant says that they do intend to return. And in many cases, we rehouse tenants for safety reasons, but they do still have that joint liability. You know, if we've got somebody with two properties simultaneously, we do have to work with them to make a dual claim. Thank you. Next slide. So we're going to have a look at two case studies now. These are both from within Peabody. We've changed the names of people, obviously, to maintain their confidentiality, but everything that's kind of mentioned is real. And Judy's just confirmed that 52 weeks is correct. Thank you, Judy. Okay, so next slide. So our first case study concerns a lady called Susan. Susan was in rent arrears to the tune of £2,000 when somebody from our collections team made contact with her. And Susan didn't have any idea at that stage that her partner hadn't been paying the rent. They were both in professional jobs, they both had income, and she had no idea that the rent wasn't being paid and thought that it was basically an administrative error or a computer error. It was only when the collections officer from that team spoke to her about setting up a direct debit that she then went on to explain that she didn't have access to her bank cards. And that was the thing that kind of triggered in that collections officer the thought that, okay, this isn't quite right, there might be other behaviours going on here. So the collections officer made a referral to our financial inclusion team to see what they could do to help. And at that point, Susan was adamant that there were no benefits that could be claimed, and again just felt that the rent arrears weren't true, that they were the result of an administrative error. Next slide. So Susan told our member of staff that she had been previously irresponsible with money, and that her partner had kind of, held on to the bank card to their joint account and given her an allowance in response to this. And that advisor gently suggested that she should be able to look at her bank statements, or that from the joint account, to see how they were managing financially. And Susan said that her partner wouldn't give her access. And he told her that she didn't understand money, and that he'd leave her if she didn't trust him. So you can see that manipulation coming in there. If you trust me, I'll look after everything. But clearly, there's now a discrepancy between that statement and the reality. And that set the alarm bells ringing again. So to avoid being confrontational, and making judgments, the advisor asked her if how she would manage if an unexpected need came up, for example, after work drinks. Would her partner increase her allowance and give her more money to attend? And it was then she kind of hesitated and said that she wouldn't be allowed to go to social activities after work. And again, you can see that more controlling behaviours. So we've got the issues with the money, not having access to correspondence, and now controlling behaviours outside of that. So the advisor asked Susan how she felt, and essentially she said that she'd got used to it because it saved the silent treatment later. Next slide, please. So what our officer did next was ask her if she would like to know what was in the joint account. And when she said that yes, she would, the advisor said that she had every right to access that account and to call the bank and to find out what the balance was, which she did. And when she did that, she realised the account was empty. And basically all the money that was going into it was being siphoned off into a separate account that she didn't recognise. It was discussed with her whether she could talk to her partner about that, and it was agreed that she would, with her brother with her. And the next day, she advised that her partner had left the property. Next slide, please. So what did we do? The first thing we advised Susan to do was open up an account just in her sole name and to have her salary paid into there rather than the joint account. And Susan found the bank very helpful, and they transferred the agreed direct debits over to her new account. She was advised to change the locks on the property, and she did. She then gathered all the unpaid bills, and we explored the liability. So where did they sit? What was her liability? And some credit agreements that she was sure she hadn't agreed to, as well as credit agreements where she couldn't quite remember. Susan didn't want to involve the police in the matter and decided she would make payments on a monthly basis to clear some of those debts. And as Susan later came to terms with the fact that she'd been abused financially, we signposted her to Victim Support and Women's Aid to help her explore her legal options. Next slide, please. So the case study A is an example of, an intimate relationship. They were partners. Case study B concerns a familial relationship. So it's important to remember that domestic abuse can happen in either setting. So intimate relationship, husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend, boyfriend and boyfriend, or familial relationship. So brothers, sisters, grown-up children and their parents, or even grandparents. So I'm going to whiz through this one really quickly, and I'm sorry that I'm speaking so quickly, but I really do want to leave us some time for Q&A. So Graham was a self-employed builder who operated on a cash basis, but realised that he needed a bank account to set up some direct debits, and his daughter stepped in and said she could use his bank account. And that worked well for both parties for a long time, until Graham started to ask, how much is in there? How much money do I have? And the daughter became evasive. Next slide, please. Graham had called our financial inclusion team because his work had dried up. And it was while he was having a conversation with that advisor about universal credit and asking for his bank details that Graham said, I don't have my own bank. It's all done through my daughter's. And it was during that conversation that additional kind of debts came to light. So some utility debts as well as some rent arrears. And when the officer delved into the situation more, what he and Graham realised was that there was a discrepancy between what Graham had paid into the account and what Graham had out of the account. And there was about £2,000 missing. Next slide, please. Familial relationships have a different dynamic, and it can be really difficult to challenge a member of your family, your own child, and accuse them of fraud or stealing. And obviously Graham didn't want to do that. But what we did do to support him from our financial inclusion team was, again, help him open up his own bank account in his own name where his direct debits could be transferred to. We signposted him to some internet training to increase his awareness, and helped him to secure a grant to clear that utility bill and to work out arrangements to clear his rent arrears and council tax debt. So although he's now estranged from his daughter and blames himself for that situation, I think we all recognise that actually the victim of domestic abuse, whatever kind of abuse that is never to blame. The sole responsibility for perpetrating abuse lies with the perpetrator. Okay, next slide, please. Conclusion. There is no one type of person who is at risk from domestic abuse. As I've just touched on briefly, domestic abuse can happen to anybody. And often victims don't realise they're being abused, whether that's economically, psychologically, emotionally. It can be really difficult to kind of get to that point of realisation where you go, gosh, yes, this is bad, this is not healthy, this is abuse. Individuals might lose all confidence in their financial ability, very much in the same way that a victim of physical abuse might consider that they have caused the abuse. And it's important not to judge. We listen, we try and understand, and then we gently ask how we can help. And a person in this situation may need time to decide what action, if any, they're ready to take. And that's also really important. you know, whether we are acting in a professional capacity or it's a friend of ours, we can't direct people to take action that we think they should take. This is down to them and their choices. Even if they're choices that we wouldn't make or think we wouldn't make, it has to be down to them. So giving people knowledge and information is what will enable them to take action when they're ready. Okay, so again, before we move on to Q&A, we've got an audio recording of a survivor of financial abuse that we're going to play.
If someone had asked me then, I would have been pissed off. If anything, I thought I was leaning on him too much. I really believed I was too irresponsible with money to handle the household spend. I felt in control because he gave me an allowance for my wages to spend on myself. It didn't seem to matter that I never saw my bank statements or bills. I didn't have to think about it, and it suited me. It was only when I got a call from the rent people that I realised things were going wrong. He got angry that they talked to me and not him, and accused me of not trusting him. I really believed that it was their error and not his. I went down to the office and they showed me no payment had been made in months. I was sure it was an error on their part, but I went to the bank after that, and after much hassle, as I didn't have my bank card, they showed me my account. It was hundreds of pounds overdrawn. I felt so stupid because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I didn't know what to do, who to talk to. It was all my fault after all, because I'd let it happen. He didn't come home, just vanished completely. I broke down after that, and it was ages before I could face what had happened. Even now, I'm still trying to sort it all out. I don't trust easily now, and that has been the worst of it. I realise now abuse isn't just about being hit or put down. It can be your dream partner actually being your worst nightmare. If someone looks too kind to be true, watch out, as they may well be.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got 8 minutes left. The remaining time is open to our audience. Any questions that people would like to ask, either myself or Judy? Are banks doing anything in recognition of the fact that debt accrued within an abusive relationship might be forced or coerced? So, Judy, that might be a good one for you. What are the banks doing in recognition of this issue?
Well, it varies from bank to bank. Some banks are more responsive than others, but now at least most of the banks now have specialist teams which deal with which help customers who've experienced this type of issue. Part of my job is contacting them to explain that the debt that they have is the debt in question is coerced, and asking for it to be written off. Some of the banks are agreeing to this, but it does vary by case to case. So it's never, well, to the people who contact us, so mostly women, I will never say it's guaranteed, but they are doing it a lot more than they used to, especially when we can offer evidence. I mean, we don't like to we don't like to ask for evidence because it shouldn't, because obviously this type of abuse is difficult to evidence by its nature. But if we can write a supporting letter or get one from a housing officer, domestic abuse worker, a GP even, that can be helpful.
Thank you. And can I ask about the gender differences? Is there a difference in the way men and women perpetrate financial abuse?
Yes. Well, it's hard to say for definite because it's quite a new area of study. But what I've seen and what my colleagues have seen is that when it tends to be when women are the abusers, it tends to be more likely to be a familial domestic abuse. So the abuse of an older parent or a sibling or another family member rather than a partner. And when it's women as the perpetrator, it tends to be more sort of exploitation rather than restriction or simply taken or using the threat of physical violence. It's tends to be more sort of preying on vulnerabilities, such as like somebody might have a learning difficulty, for example, or being in a position where they're socially isolated. Whereas, I mean, all these things are perpetrated by both genders actually, but that's something that seems to be the case with the gender difference. With male victims, there's male perpetrators, sorry, there tends to be more likely to be the threat of physical violence, and there's still if you see on the wheel, one of the sections is using male privilege, and what we mean by that there is still this idea of man as provider, woman as homemaker, and that can be sort of exploited by either gender, really, depending on who is the abuser. But we often see it used as by male perpetrators to say, well, it's my responsibility and my right to take care of the bills, to have access to the bank account, to be in charge of that area of life.
Thank you. And we just had another question come in. If we know that a resident is not returning to the same Peabody property, should we be applying for dual housing benefit? So this is where we need Danny. Judy, do you know how it, if you're not planning on returning, I know you can still claim for dual housing benefit, but I know it's for a much shorter period of time. Do you know?
I think it's like 26 weeks rather than, or shorter rather than the 52. I know I worked with somebody who she didn't return because it just wasn't safe, but she claimed dual housing benefit because all of her things were there, all of her furniture, her documents, everything. So she had to return to get those things and to move on, and that was accepted actually as a legitimate reason for dual housing to be paid, even though she wasn't actually going to live there.
So I suppose the answer is yes, but what we can't answer is how long that dual claim will be valid for, and it would depend on the circumstances. But to the person that's asked the question, what we can do is speak to our in-house experts and get some clarity around that. And somebody else has asked, how do you claim dual housing benefit?
Well, with I think most new claims are via universal credit, and in my experience, the most successful way is to say from the very beginning on the claim, like in the journal, that dual housing benefit is needed for this reason as well, and that has worked.
And Peabody do have a universal benefits expert. So if you do need advice, particularly around making a dual claim, they'll be able to help you. So again, do get in touch and have a conversation about the individual circumstances of that case. And one more question, and this will probably have to be our last as we come up to 11 o'clock. So in some cultures, like in the Chinese culture, men pretty much always manage household finances. What would you suggest to women in family or relationship dynamics to challenge this?
This is really, it's really difficult because it comes to that area where it's not like the sort of the grey area that can be between abuse and what is just the way things are done and always have been. If there's abuse, if the women in question don't think it would be safe or don't feel it would be safe to challenge or to change or know there would be repercussions of some sort, we would, rather than challenging the men or the structure that's keeping that there, we would be talking about making them as safe as possible, and helping them set up their own bank accounts, for example, make their own benefit claim, but in a way that's safe for them, and to potentially talk about options of leaving that situation.
Yeah.
When there's not abuse, but it's just the way the family dynamics are, I have to be honest, it falls a bit out of my area, because it would depend very much on that family and that culture, really.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because as you say, this can fall into two camps. Either there's abuse and it would be dealt with from that perspective, or this is just the way it is. And often when we look at, when we do domestic abuse training, we look at coercive control, there might be some things that in one relationship are perfectly okay, and in a different relationship are not okay. And it often comes down to what is the intent here. And is the intent to control, degrade, and restrict somebody's access to resources? And is there a consequence to somebody pushing back? So in a healthy relationship, I can push back on something and I don't get beaten for it, or I don't get abused for it. We have a dialogue and negotiate. In an abusive relationship, that's not the case. There are consequences. So it's important to think about the behaviours in that context as well. Like, what is the intent behind them, and are there any consequences to saying, actually, I don't want to do that. I want to have control of my own money. One is abusive, one is not. And the abusive side, as Judy said, we would manage differently.
Yeah.
And with safety in mind.
I just remembered one of my previous roles was working with refugees who'd come to the country fairly recently and were being resettled, and often only one partner would look after the finances, would have a bank account, usually the male, but not always. And the women would say, I can't be bothered with that. I'm looking after the kids, the education, the house. He can deal with it. I've got enough on my plate. And the way we wouldn't tell them that they had to, but the way we would frame it was that, well, it's safer for you. I mean, imagine, God forbid, something happened to him, if he lost the card, if he was sick, or if he was incapacitated in some way, you wouldn't know your PIN number, you wouldn't have access to the bank account. And think of the stress for both of you. It's a way of managing something that's quite stressful and making it more manageable and less of a burden on one person. And often that was a way for them both to say, actually, yeah. And the man, usually the man, if he wasn't abusive, if it wasn't abuse that was motivating the behaviour, would say, actually, yeah, it will take a lot of weight off me, if she's got her own card as well, and I don't have to be on hand to provide the PIN number, etc. And it's the same with older people, like my grandparents' generation. It was always the women who looked after the wages and then would count out the housekeeping money and the spare money afterwards. But then if one partner died, the other one who wasn't in control would be completely stuck. And that was a way of challenging it with them as well, to say, it's not safe really just for it to all be in the hands of one person.
Okay. Well, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you, Judy, for joining us. Thank you to all our attendees today. It's been really interesting. We've posted the chat support lines into the chat, but we'll also send around the relevant links. And like I said, this will be recorded and available to listen to again, either via the website or our intranet. If there are any outstanding questions, I've put my email address in there. Feel free to get in touch. But thank you all very much for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.